Welcome, Fright Night Vault listeners. Tonight we leave the smoke of the cities and the bustle of the modern world. We travel back 2 centuries to the rolling hills of Tennessee, where the land was wide, the nights were long, and families lived by the sweat of their hands. The year was the early 1800s, a time when the wilderness pressed close, when faith in God was strong, and when superstition was whispered only in private. The place was quiet farmland. Cornfields rustled under the sun. Families rose before dawn, worked until dusk, prayed together at night. Life was simple. Life was harsh. And for one family, life was about to be destroyed. It began as small things easy to ignore. At night, tapping sounds on the walls, not loud, not violent, just a faint knock, as though a hand was rapping from the outside, then scratching, like claws moving across wood. The family looked but saw nothing. The fields lay empty, the yard still. They prayed and they went to bed again. But the sounds grew louder. The knocking became pounding. The scratching became tearing. Chains were heard dragging across the floorboards, though no chain was found. Heavy stones seemed to strike the walls, though nothing left a mark. The nights became longer. Sleep grew thin. The family began to dread the dark. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like wind moving through the trees. But soon, words could be made out. Mocking words, cruel words, a voice that shifted, sometimes low, sometimes shrill, sometimes echoing like many voices at once. It laughed when they prayed. It mocked when they sang hymns. The voice knew their names. Objects moved on their own. Blankets were ripped from beds. Hair was pulled in the night. Invisible hands slapped at faces. Children woke with red marks across their skin. The unseen tormentor seemed to grow stronger every day, feeding on their fear, delighting in their suffering. Neighbors were invited to witness it. Ministers came to pray. All of them heard the knocks. All of them heard the voice. Some claimed to be struck themselves by invisible blows. And still, the thing did not leave. The farm that had once been a place of peace had become a prison. By day, the family worked their land in silence, their eyes always on the edge of the woods, waiting. By night, they huddled together, bracing for the storm that always came. The voice, the violence, the terror, and the terror had only begun. The family tried to pray it away. They recited verses until their voices cracked. They sang hymns until their throats burned. Ministers were brought into the house, men of scripture who believed no darkness could withstand the power of God. But when the prayers rose, the voice rose louder. It laughed at them. It mocked their words, repeating scripture back in a twisted tone, as though to prove it knew their faith better than they did. And then it began to speak clearly, not whispers anymore, but a voice that filled the rooms as if someone were standing among them. Sometimes it was a woman's voice, sharp and mocking. Sometimes a man's voice, cruel and booming. Sometimes many voices together, speaking in unison, surrounding the family in a circle of sound. It introduced itself as a spirit, intelligent, cunning, and hateful. It knew their secrets. It called them by name. It told the children things they had said when no one else was near. At night, it sang to them, not with comfort, but with malice. Lullabies twisted into threats, and the torment grew physical. The children were not just pulled from their beds, they were beaten. Invisible hands left welts and bruises. Hair was yanked until clumps came out in the children's fists. They were pinched, scratched, and thrown to the floor as the family watched in helpless terror. When the father tried to stop it, he too was struck down, coughing, clutching his throat as though unseen fingers had tightened around his windpipe. Neighbors began to visit, curious about the tales. They left pale, shaken, unwilling to speak of what they had witnessed. Some claimed they had been slapped across the face by a hand they could not see. Others heard the voice mocking them as soon as they stepped inside the farmhouse. Still, the spirit did not leave. It seemed to delight in its growing audience, growing louder, stronger, crueler. It conversed with visitors, mocking their accents, reciting sermons back to the ministers who came to drive it out. It knew scripture, it knew songs, it knew the private thoughts of men. No one could explain how. Word spread through the countryside of the farm where a voice spoke without a body, where children were beaten by nothing, where hymns could not drive away the dark. Some began to whisper that it was not merely a ghost, but something far older, far darker, a witch's curse, returned to torment the living. The family no longer felt safe in their own home. Each night was a trial. Each day was shadowed by the knowledge that night would fall again. And when night fell, the spirit would return. And it was only growing stronger. The spirit no longer contented itself with tormenting children. Its rage grew fixated, directed with precision against the head of the household. He was a strong man, used to labor, used to the hardships of farm life. But no strength could shield him from what was now inside his home. He would sit in his chair, weary from the day's work, when his body would suddenly convulse as though struck. His shoes were pulled from his feet by unseen hands. His tongue stiffened in his mouth until he could no longer speak. His eyes bulged with silent panic as his family rushed to his side, helpless, watching the invisible choke him. The entity seemed to delight in his suffering, mocking him in front of his wife and children, calling him names, threatening to end him slowly. Night after night, his strength drained, his health faltered, his face grew pale, his body frail. It was as if the spirit was not merely tormenting him, it was feeding on him. Neighbors returned, hoping to witness the terror for themselves. They did not leave disappointed. One man reported being struck so hard by the unseen force that he fell to the floor, blood filling his mouth. Another heard the voice mimic his own words, repeating his thoughts before he had spoken them aloud. The farmhouse became a theater of horror, and the spirit its master of ceremonies. The ministers tried again. They read their scriptures, raised their voices, demanded the entity leave in the name of God. The walls shook. The voice screamed, mocking them, spitting their prayers back in twisted cadence. Hymns turned to howls. Holy words dissolved into laughter. The ministers left humbled, their authority stripped, their courage tested. The torment was no longer bound to the farmhouse. Travelers through the area told of hearing voices on the road at night, of their horses rearing in terror at shadows that had no form. The curse seemed to bleed into the soil itself. And then came the visitor who would make the haunting legendary. A man of power, a soldier, a politician, a future president of the United States. He brought with him his men, determined to face whatever haunted the farm. They arrived confident, mocking the stories they had heard. But when the night fell and the voice rose, their confidence shattered. Horses reared, refusing to enter the property. Weapons were shaken from their hands. Invisible hands struck them, their courage drained in an instant. The great man himself declared the place too terrible to endure, and he fled. If a leader, hardened by war, could not withstand the power in that house, what chance did a family have? The entity had proven itself. It could speak, it could strike, it could weaken, it could drive out even the most powerful. And now its appetite seemed set on one thing alone, the destruction of the family's patriarch. The attacks did not relent. Night after night, the voice mocked him. Day after day, his strength waned. What began as coughs and spasms grew into trembling, weakness, and collapse. His family tried to care for him, but every attempt was undone by the torment that surrounded their home. The spirit's hatred was no longer hidden. It spoke openly of its desire to see him destroyed. In front of neighbors, in front of ministers, in front of his own children, it declared that it would bring about his end. And so the family waited in dread, powerless, as the sickness deepened. In the final days of his life, the unseen force mocked him cruelly. His medicine, a vial carefully prepared to ease his suffering, was replaced. On the morning of his death, when the bottle was inspected, it was found to contain a black, foul liquid no one recognized. When they demanded to know what it was, the voice rang out, shrill with triumph. "I gave it to him. I fixed his medicine. I killed old Jack." And he was dead. The patriarch of the family, worn down by months of torment, poisoned by forces unseen, was laid to rest. As the mourners gathered at the graveside, heads bowed in solemn prayer, the voice returned once more. It laughed, it sang, it mocked the dead even as he was lowered into the earth. The funeral itself was interrupted by the thing that had taken his life, jeering at the family as though to say, "Even in death, you are mine." Neighbors whispered that no ghost in all of America had ever been so violent, so intelligent, so relentless. This was no wandering soul. This was something darker, a curse that spoke, a presence that killed. Even after his death, the spirit did not fully depart. It lingered in the house, tormenting the children, mocking the widow, delighting in its victory. Visitors continued to hear its voice, to feel its strikes, to witness its strength. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the violence diminished. The attack slowed, the voice faded, but it never left completely. Some claimed the spirit promised to return, that its work was not yet finished. Others said it had rooted itself in the land, cursed to echo through the generations. In the years that followed, neighbors swore they heard the same voice in the woods, on the roads, in the night wind. The farm became a place of legend, a place feared, a place remembered, not only for the cruelty of what had happened, but for the certainty that it had truly happened. After the patriarch was laid into the ground, the family prayed that the torment would end with him. For a time, the house fell quieter. The nights grew less violent. The voice, once constant, receded into silence. But silence is not always peace. The spirit had not vanished. It lingered, watching, waiting. It whispered on certain nights when the wind pressed against the walls. It sang mockingly when the widow knelt to pray. Visitors still reported being struck, their hair pulled, their cheeks stung by unseen hands. The house was never truly free. Neighbors continued to tell the tale. The countryside spoke of the farm where an invisible voice drove a man to his grave, where chains rattled in empty rooms, where the air itself seemed cursed. Travelers avoided the land. Horses balked when led down the road. Families hurried past with their heads lowered, unwilling to look at the farmhouse. The spirit, some claimed, promised to return. It declared that it would come back after many years, to once again plague the descendants of the family it had ruined. And so the legend grew, not just of what had happened, but of what might still come. Generations passed the story down. Parents whispered it to their children as a warning. Preachers mentioned it in sermons, a reminder of unseen evil. And long after the original family was gone, the land remained feared. Those who dared to walk its fields at night told of hearing whispers in the dark. A woman's mocking laughter carried on the wind, shadows moving between trees, though no living soul was there. The haunting became more than a tale. It became part of the soil itself. A curse remembered by all who lived near, a reminder that some spirits do not rest, even after centuries have passed. And though the voice eventually faded from the house, the story never did. It is told still, not as a legend, but as history, a haunting that did not end with whispers and scratches, but with a death claimed by the spirit itself. The Bell Farm was no longer just land. It was a scar, and scars do not heal. You have heard the story of a family torn apart, of whispers that mocked scripture, of invisible hands that struck children, and of a voice that claimed the death of the man it hated most. You have heard of ministers humbled, neighbors terrified, and even men of power driven away in fear. It may sound like the invention of folklore, a ghost story exaggerated in the telling, stretched across generations. But what you have just heard is no invention. It was witnessed, it was recorded, it was feared by all who lived near. The story you just heard is no invention. You can look it up. The incident is called the Bell Witch Haunting, and its legend has endured for over 2 centuries, inspiring countless books, studies, and even the film An American Haunting. The truth is this: not all ghost stories are superstition. Some root themselves in history, feeding generation after generation, refusing to die. The Bell Witch remains one of the most violent hauntings ever documented, and its name is whispered still in the hills of Tennessee. And so, listeners of the vault, guard your walls when the knocking begins. Pray hard when the laughter comes from nowhere. Because once a spirit decides to hate, it does not stop with death. It carries on. It waits. It remembers. If you made it this far, you are one of us now. Like this tale if the truth chilled you, and share your own stories of the restless dead in the comments below. Subscribe to The Vault and never walk alone again. We return nightly with another truth, another shadow, another horror buried in plain sight. Until then, keep the lantern close and your prayers closer, for not every haunting fades. Some last forever. See you on the next video.